A couple years ago, I put out a video about my Euro Nymphing setup and some suggestions for a beginner Euro Nymphing setup. And since then, my rig philosophy and just the makeup of the rig itself has changed a lot. And I still get questions from that video about those rigs. And I felt like it was time to go ahead and put out an update video to explain how my philosophy's changed and what my setup is now. So on the screen here, you'll see my suggestion for a beginner Euro Nymphing setup. And then we'll also go over, once you kind of get casting that rig down and get a little bit more advanced in your feel for casting Euro Nymphing rigs, we can move on to some rigs that are more appropriate and have a little bit more performance for experienced Euro Nymphers. All right, in front of me here, I have a truncated version of the rig I recommend beginners start out with. The components between this and the more experienced rigs are pretty much the same. It's just a few line diameter changes. So I'll just use this to go over and explain some of the philosophy behind the components. For a fly line, I've got a 0.022 level Euro Nymphing line. The minimum diameter that's legal under the fifth smoosh competition rules. You want a thin diameter fly line since it generally can end up in the guides, and when it does, you don't want it to sag back towards the reel. That'll end up pulling your rig towards you and ruining your drifts. So you want as thin a fly line as possible to sit in your guides and not create that sag. That's why you don't want to use like a standard weight forward line when you're Euro Nymphing. For a fly line to leader connection, I use Devin Olson's micro loop. What he essentially does is he folds over the fly line itself and then uses a few wraps of some securing thread to close up the loop. And as you can see, just a very, very tiny loop that's just enough to get a leader section of line through. This 12-pound test barely goes through this. But you can see how low profile the knot is. And since this knot tends to end up in your guides, or if you're fighting fish and the fish takes line, it can go out through the tip of your guides. And when you're kind of pulling line in to keep up with the rig, if this knot is not low profile, it's going to click on each guide and be super annoying. So this knot doesn't do that. And to me, this is the only way to attach a fly line to the butt section of the leader. I don't think a nail knot is nearly as smooth going through the guides as this. So I recommend doing this. I just tie a clinch knot into the loop like you would a hook eye. If you haven't tried this out, highly recommend it. It'll make your experience with fly line in the guides a lot better when you're... For the butt section itself, I'm using what would normally be a 11 to 18 foot section of Maxima Chameleon. This is 12-pound for the beginner setup. As you drop down to more micro rigs and get better at casting the rig accurately, you can start dropping this down to 10, 8, 6, maybe even 4-pound test. But for beginners, I recommend starting at 12. It'll give you a little bit better accuracy and turnover when casting the rig. And once you get that stuff down, start thinking about stepping down your diameters. You'll get better presentations at longer distances as you step down your butt section diameter. But this is a pretty good performing rig for beginners. So this is where I recommend starting. Again, it would typically be 11 to 18 feet. I tend to fish 11 to 12 feet because I fish competition legal rigs. So when you put the whole thing together, your leader can only be twice the length of the rod, and that's the butt section that allows me to. But you can go longer if you really want to go like the mono rig route. You can go as long as you really want. So what's changed about this from my previous video is I used to do a taper, like from 15 to 12 pound test chameleon, or from 12 to 10 pound test chameleon, or 10 to 8, and tie a blood knot in the middle to connect them. But I've found that that blood knot really is in the tip of the guides a lot. That blood knot just is not smooth enough to go through the guides when you're one, casting line, and two, pulling line in to keep up with the rig. And you really get those clicks in the guides, and it's just a huge quality of life headache when you're Euro nymphing. So using just a flat piece of line, yeah, it'll be a little bit tougher to cast the rig, but when you're actually fishing it, I think the benefits of a flat level section of butt leader material far outweighs putting blood knots in and making a taper. So now I recommend just using a flat section of butt section. Moving on to the next part, when we connect the butt section of the leader to the cider material, we use a blood knot. For the beginner rig, I recommend using 1x, like 0.010 diameter cider material. One, it's a little bit easier to see because it's thicker, and two, it's just a step down from the diameter of the chameleon, which is 0.013. So you do get a little bit of taper that helps in turning over the rig and being accurate. So you want your cider material to be just a slightly narrower diameter than the butt section of the leader. I personally like putting tags in my cider section still. I know some people just don't bother with the tags anymore and just attach the cider, but I put in the tags because it helps me get an idea of how far my rig is off the water or fishing near the water surface right when the rig lands in the water. So for me, I like the reds on the top of the cider section and on the bottom because I picked the red up a little bit better. But I do have that two-tone tag end on both sides, so it helps me locate the top and bottom of the cider better. So for me, I just look for this tag section and make sure, it's riding about, 2 to however many inches you want it up above the surface of the water. You never want this section in the water. You want it to ride above, and by having that little tag section, it's easier to locate. The same reason I put a little tag section in the middle, just helps me keep track of where the whole rig is at all times. But that's personal preference. You can either put in the tags or not. So for this Rio material, the colored sections are about 7 inches long. What I've done is taken a full section of red and tied 2 nearly full sections of yellow together, followed by a full section of red. So that gets you to about 25 inches. Cider. You can make it longer or shorter depending on your personal preference. Also, other cider materials or other cider companies, let's see if I can. Well, other cider companies have a different length, so you might need to adjust your rig based on whether you're using like Cortland or SA tippet material or cider material. Let's see, there it is. Yeah, see, this Cortland one is about 10 inches long in between each colored sections. So I adjust my rig a little bit depending on what company cider material I'm using. But these tag ends haven't changed much from my original rig. I like the way I can locate the rig, so I just stick. So the cider material is attached to a 2mm tippet ring. For the cider to tippet ring connection, I use clinch knots. And the reason I do that is because it'll stick out 90 degrees from the knot, so it's just easy to locate the tag end. Tippet ring is. For the tippet ring to tippet connection, I use an Orvis knot here. And the reason I use an Orvis knot here is because I use clinch knots to attach flies. And the Orvis knot is a little bit stronger than a clinch knot. So if I get snagged and, say the bottom fly gets caught on something on the bottom and I just can't get it out, by having the Orvis knot here, it'll make sure that when I break off the flies, it doesn't break at this knot and I lose the whole rig. It'll generally break off either at the triple surgeons and at least I save my length of long tippet, or usually it just breaks off the clinch knot at the flies and then you can just retie a fly versus retying your whole rig. That's why I use the Orvis. For tippet, I use a 4 to 6 inch piece of 5X. I love Umpqua Deceiver X. It's my favorite tippet for nymphing. I use this in generally sizes from, well, my Stillwater leaders and streamer leaders, I use, 0x all the way up to 5x for deceiver. When I go smaller, I tend to use 5.5x a lot. I do go into the Trout Hunter fluorocarbon because they have the half. But Trout Hunter, Deceiver X, both good stuff. Highly recommend it. But I do 4 to 6 feet to a triple surgeon's knot. Tying a triple surgeons helps you create a tag. You always want to snip off the top end of the tag and leave the bottom part of the tag for your dropper fly. And then I go into 22 to 24 inches of another piece of 5x tippet down to my point fly. I tend to like having my point fly be my heavier fly and my dropper fly be my lighter fly. To me, this makes me feel like the rig is more in line versus having a hinge. I think the heavier fly on the dropper sometimes creates a hinge. It makes me feel less connected to the rig. And I feel like I have better strike detection personally when the heavier fly is on point. I know a lot of great Euro Nymphers disagree and reverse it and put that. But I still do it this way. Moving on, there's one other rig I wanted to discuss that you can use with your Euro nymphing rods. And this is a hybrid Euro dry fly rig. So I experimented with this iteration of the rig a lot this summer. I found it especially adept on small streams where I didn't want to carry 2 rods and I wanted to be able to both Euro nymph and dry fly fish. And this rig is kind of a happy medium to being able to do both adequately, but they're not specialized for either one. With this Euro rig, it's a little bit more, I'd say you have to fish at shorter distances, but you still get the same concept of a nymph under some sort of cider. In this case, we're using Scaphar's wax. And you can still fish it up to 20-25 feet. And you can also dry fly cast this rig. So by switching out your nymphs, taking off the cider wax, and putting a dry fly or dry dropper rig on your tippet and on point, this will adequately do an overhand cast dry fly rig cast, essentially. So this rig fishes a dry fly pretty well up to about 25 feet, where the rod itself can propel the leader and turn it over enough to turn over a dry fly. So it's good for tight spaces that way, or short casts where you can sneak up on some fish or fish some heavier water and just get the dry fly into the spots you need. It also casts pretty well between 30 and 45 feet. Once there's 10 to 15 to maybe even 20 feet of fly line out through the guides. And that way the fly line can get enough force into the rod to bend the rod and get some line shooting capability, instead of using your cast to bend the rod with the leader like you do on the shorter distances. So outside 30 feet or inside 20 to 25 feet, you can adequately fish a dry fly rig. There is kind of a dead zone in between that 25 to 30 footish range where there's not enough fly line out of the rod tip to bend the rod and get the rig to turn over, but it's too long to use a whippy Euro Nymphing type cast to get the rig to turn over as well. And your cast kind of falls apart during that range, so you need to set up to either make the long cast or the short cast. But it allows you to fish a dry fly or nymph on the same exact rig without switching out spools or even switching out tippet. So in that way, it's a super versatile rig and will allow you to fish for both subsurface eating fish or dry fly. So getting into the rig itself. So this fly line is pretty specific that I use. On this reel itself, I have an Orvis Hydros Tactical Nymph line. There's also a Scientific Angler's Mastery Euro Tactical line. Orvis owns SA, so it's probably the same line. But what makes this line unique is that it tapers down to about 0.022, about a Euro nymphing line, but it comes in a slight double taper. So there's some taper to this fly line, it's not level. So once enough of the head, so to speak, is out through the guides, it acts kind of like a fly line, like a standard fly line. So it'll turn over your rig adequately enough to use it, but it's also thin enough that it's not going to sag too much in the guides when you're. So you can either do this or use a standard lightweight dry fly line. It'll be better for casting a dry fly, but it'll be a little worse for nymphing. So you can kind of make that trade-off. I would not use a level Euro nymphing line for this route. But since this fly line comes with a loop, I just tie into the loop with a clinch knot like I do with all my standard fly lines. I still think this is the best fly line to butt section leader connection to get through the guides. So, all right, this is what I do here. For this specific one, we want a heavier butt section. So a 6-pound butt section is not going to turn over a dry fly. It's just not. You got to use 12 or maybe 10 if you're using small dry flies. But I'm using a 10 to 12 foot section of 12-pound Maxima Chameleon. Again. And the reason we're using 10 to 12 feet here is because any longer and then the rig's just too long to turn over. With the 10 to 12 foot section, you're getting a 16 to 21 foot dry fly leader. I err towards the shorter version. 16 feet is easiest dry fly casting for me, and you can still Euro nymph with it, just not so much at range. It's just a flat section, again, no taper. We don't want to deal with the knots in the guides again. So just a lock section of maximum chameleon to a blood knot and the 2 feet of 3x tippet material. It can either be fluorocarbon or it could be nylon monofilament. It doesn't matter. I'm just using fluoro here. So we have a 2-foot section here. This will add a little bit of taper into the rig to help rigs turn over, but it also provides us with a section of line that when we're nymphing, we can turn into a cider material. The way we do that is we use cider wax. This is Scafar's neon wax. This one's orange. It comes in all different colors. There's everything from yellow to oranges to reds, pinks. You can just choose whichever one works for you. So we're going to gum up my fingers. But the way this works to turn this piece of 3x tippet into cider is you press it into the wax, pull, and this wax is pretty cold, so it's going to take this to fit the cider onto here. You can see now that we put some wax onto the cider here. And I know the light's not great, see it, but there is an orange material, and in sunlight, for better lighting, it does glow pretty good. So that turns your piece of tippet into a cider material. You'll see it thickens up a little bit too. So it does show up pretty well. You will have to reapply it every now and then if you dunk the tippet. But when you want a nymph, this is how you create a cider material. And when you dry fly, you just pull it right off the tippet and you have clear fly line again. Or clear tippet section. Hands, we'll just ignore that now. Below this, we're using some cider wax, but we're using a 5-foot section of 5x fluoro tippet. We're connecting them together with a blood knot. We don't want to use a tippet ring here because I don't like tippet rings on my dry fly rig. So instead of a tippet ring, we're just using a blood knot for the connection. It'll still hold up on a nymphing rig. So we have our section of tippet. Then you can either just tie off a single nymph rig, a single nymph for a single nymph rig here, or a single dry fly for a single dry fly rig. Or here I'm using a triple surgeons to a dropper tag for a dry fly, and I've got a caddis dry fly on here. And then you can use a however long, generally 2 to 4 foot piece of 5x tippet below it, and you can put a nymph there and fish this as a dry dropper. So it's pretty versatile rig. You could put 2 nymphs on here and have a double nymph rig. Like I said, the single fly rigs or dry dropper. But what this rig really just allows you to do is using the cider wax and using the way this rig's built. You can just be nymph through a hole, see a fish come up, throw a dry fly on there in no time, and fish a dry fly, and just keep switching back and forth. And no spool switching, no having to put line back through the guides. You can just easily switch from dry fly to nymphing. Like I said, it's not going to be great, like absolutely perfect for doing either, but it will do either adequately and you'll catch a bunch of fish and be pretty efficient. But anyway, I encourage you to go experiment with some of my rigs. Let me know how you like them, what you would change. Of course, this is all subjective. This is just how I like building my rigs at the moment. Maybe it'll change in 2 years like my old one did. But I'm pretty happy with how I've got my rig set up. I've gotten pretty comfortable with them, and they all fish great. This one's pretty fun during summer when you're out, far away from hiking into places and only can bring one rod with you, and this allows you to not have to choose between a dry fly and nymphing rig. You can do both. Anyways, like I said, comment down below if you have any questions or want to talk about the rigs a little bit more, or tell me how you guys set up your Euro nymphing rigs, or even your hybrid rigs as well. If you enjoyed this video, like it down below, subscribe. Anyways, thanks for watching.